Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a stack of material in front of us today. Articles, reports, some really deep expert analysis. And it's all focused on one, well, frankly, astonishing event. Operation Web, or Arisha, as it's called in Ukraine.
Yeah, this one really made waves.
It wasn't just, another strike. This was huge. A massive synchronized drone operation reaching deep, really deep inside Russia, hitting strategic aircraft, multiple key airfields all at once.
It's an operation that immediately grabbed global attention. And looking through these sources, you see why. It wasn't just where it happened, but how.
Exactly.
This was clearly something meticulously planned, going after some of Russia's absolute highest value strategic assets, thousands of kilometers from any front line.
Absolutely. So our mission today for you listening is to try and unpack how this was even technically possible. What was the real impact, on Russia's strategic capabilities, and what are people saying about it internationally?
Right, there's a lot to get into. Okay, let's dive in. So maybe start with the basics. What exactly unfolded on June 1st, according to the reports?
Okay, so the sources say June 1st, 2025. Ukraine's SBU, their security service, they carry out this major operation. Codename, Web.
And the targets?
Incredibly specific. Russia's strategic bomber fleet. We're talking Tu-95s, Tu-22M3s, Tu-160s, and also those really crucial A-50 radar planes, the eyes in the sky.
And the locations were nowhere near the border, right? I mean, looking at the map here.
Not even close. The reports mention 4 key airfields deep inside Russia. You've got Belaya way out in the Irkutsk region.
Siberia, basically.
Yeah. Then Alenia up near Murmansk in the Arctic North. Dyagilevo near Ryazan, closer to Moscow but still deep. And Ivanovo, also in central Russia.
Some of those are like thousands of kilometers inside Russian territory. It's pretty stunning.
It really is. And the scale, too. One source mentions 117 FPV drones used in what they called a synchronized attack across these, vastly separated places.
And this wasn't just cooked up overnight, was it? The planning sounds intense. No, definitely not spur of the moment. Reports indicate this was in the works for over 18 months.
18 months. Wow.
Yeah, with direct oversight reportedly going all the way up to President Zelenskyy. That level of long-term planning for a drone strike is pretty remarkable.
Okay, now this is where it gets really, really interesting for me. The how. Because, look, the FPV drones we hear about constantly on the front lines, they usually have a control range of what? Maybe 20 kilometers tops?
Right. That's the standard limitation.
So how on earth did they reach targets potentially thousands of kilometers away? That's the big question.
That's the absolute core puzzle here. And the sources, they reveal what's described as a really unique scheme. It wasn't about flying them all the way. It involved getting the FPV drones into Russia beforehand.
Wait, hang on. So they weren't launched from Ukraine or near the border?
Not for the whole journey, no.
Yeah.
The method described involved smuggling the drones into Russia.
Smuggling FPV drones? How?
Well, the reports suggest things like hidden in trucks, maybe stored under the roofs of buildings, but located much, much closer to the target airfields inside Russia.
Okay.
And then, from these hidden spots, special containers holding the drones could be opened remotely, releasing the swarm for that final, much shorter flight to the target.
Right, so they're smuggled close, then launched remotely. But even launching from, say, a few dozen kilometers away, that's still pushing or exceeding that standard 20K FPV range, isn't it? How is that part controlled?
This is where the tech gets really clever. Expert analysis, like from Defense Express, suggests the drones likely used artificial intelligence.
AI on FPV drones.
Yeah, and machine vision for autonomous flight, for big chunks of that final approach.
Yeah.
Basically flying themselves from point A, the hidden launch spot, to point B, the general target area, without constant human piloting.
But I saw some clips, didn't you? It looked like operators were still involved somehow making decisions.
Exactly. It seems to be a hybrid approach.
Yeah.
So the AI handles the difficult navigation, getting it over the distance, maybe dealing with initial defenses. But then operators likely receive video feeds over very long distances, potentially all the way back to Kyiv. Some sources speculate allowing them to make those critical final second decisions.
Like what? Confirming the target?
Yeah, confirming the specific aircraft, maybe assessing damage from previous hits, deciding not to strike if a plane was already burning. That crucial human judgment at the very end.
So we're talking about pretty standard 8 or 10-inch FPV drones, the kind used on the front lines.
Pretty much, yeah.
But adapted with this sophisticated AI for navigation and some kind of long-range video link for terminal guidance.
That seems to be the picture painted by the analysis. And it's just a textbook example of asymmetric warfare, isn't it?
Absolutely. Using relatively cheap, almost off-the-shelf tech to go after incredibly expensive strategic assets.
With devastating results.
Which, yeah, brings us right to the next big question everyone's asking. Why didn't Russian defenses stop this? I mean, these are strategic airfields. You'd assume top priority protection deep inside the country.
It does seem baffling at first glance, doesn't it? But when you break it down based on the material, it starts to make more sense.
Okay.
First off, traditional anti-aircraft systems, missiles, big radars, guns, they're largely useless against these small, fast, low-flying FPV drones.
Right. Too small, too agile.
Exactly. They're just not designed for that kind of target. So the main defense should be electronic warfare, REB, as they call it, jamming the control signals, the video feeds.
So why didn't that work?
Well, multiple potential reasons emerge from the sources. One big one, a simple lack of sufficient REB systems deployed at these deep rear bases.
Really? Why?
The speculation is that many systems have been moved forward towards occupied Ukraine, where the drone threat is constant, and frankly, where Russian REB is already stretched thin and facing its own countermeasures.
So they stripped the rear bases to cover the front.
It's a plausible explanation for the gaps. Plus, remember the AI factor we just discussed?
Ah, right. If the drone is flying autonomously for part of the way,
it's inherently less vulnerable to jamming because it doesn't need that constant control signal from an operator. It might just need intermittent commands or rely on its own navigation until the final moments. AI could also potentially help it navigate around known RB zones.
Okay, that makes sense. But then we saw those frankly bizarre images. The tires piled on top of bomber wings. What on earth was that about?
Ah, yes, the infamous tire defense. Visually striking, wasn't it?
Understatement.
It seems it was a somewhat desperate, improvised attempt to provide some kind of crude overhead protection against drone strikes. Maybe thinking of simpler drop munitions.
But completely useless against FPVs.
Totally ineffective, as the analysis points out.
Right.
FPVs aren't just dropping, they're guided precisely, often coming in low and targeting specific weak points like engine intakes, landing gear, or, as happened here, fuel tanks and wing routes. Tires on top do nothing against that.
It really speaks to a lack of understanding or preparedness for this specific threat, doesn't it?
It certainly suggests they weren't expecting this kind of sophisticated, targeted attack so deep inside their territory. And then you had reports of Russian police trying to shoot down these fast-moving drones with, like, assault rifles.
Yeah, I saw that too. Which is acknowledged as basically futile.
Right. Another sign of ineffective last-ditch measures.
So putting it all together, it really does look like Russia was caught fundamentally unprepared for this type of asymmetric deep strike capability.
It exposed some pretty significant blind spots, you have to say, especially far from the active war zone. A failure to adapt their defenses in the deep rear to the realities of modern drone warfare.
Okay, let's shift to the impact then. What were the actual results? What got hit? What was destroyed?
Well, Ukraine's SBU initially claimed a very high number, 41 aircraft hit. That number was later confirmed by Ukraine's general staff as of June 3rd.
41, that's huge. But what about independent verification? Can we confirm that?
Independent analysis of satellite imagery is crucial here. It takes time, obviously. But sources like McKinsey Intelligence Services, cited in some reports, have confirmed significant damage and outright destruction. The number concerned destroyed so far seems to be at least 11 strategic bombers across the different airfields.
Even 11 is a massive blow, isn't it? For these kinds of planes.
Oh, absolutely. A major, major loss. And the analysis suggests the full count of damaged or destroyed aircraft could still rise as more imagery becomes available and is assessed.
And the targeting wasn't just random hits, right? The reports emphasized the precision involved.
Exactly. Defense Express, for example, really highlighted this. The drones weren't just hitting the planes anywhere. They were hitting specific, incredibly vulnerable points.
Like what?
Like the central fuel tanks on the 222 M3s, or the critical wing root structure right near the fuel tanks on the 295 MS bombers. Very precise aiming.
And hitting those specific spots is so critical because why?
Because hitting those areas, especially, and this is key, when the planes were likely fueled up, maybe preparing for missions, it caused massive, uncontrollable fires.
Ah, the fuel.
Exactly. These weren't just small fires causing repairable damage. These were infernos leading to catastrophic structural failure or the complete incineration of the aircraft. The clear goal wasn't just to damage them, it was to make them irreparable, to take them off the board permanently.
The economic cost alone must be astronomical. The SBU estimated over $7 billion.
That was their figure. And whether it's exactly that or slightly different, the core point is the staggering economic impact, which leads to the cost-effectiveness aspect. This is where it gets, well, mind-boggling.
Right, the drone cost versus the plane cost.
Yeah. Clash report called the gap impressive, which feels like an understatement.
Yeah.
Think about it. The FPV drones used probably cost somewhere between $300 and $600 each. Maybe a bit more with the sophisticated parts, but still orders of magnitude less than the target.
And a strategic bomber, like a 295.
Costs well over $100 million each.
So $100 million plus versus maybe $600? That's I can't even do the math easily.
Someone did. One source calculated the cost disparity at over 100,000 times.
100,000 times more cost-effective for the attacker. Wow.
It just starkly illustrates the new economics of warfare we're entering.
And a really critical point that comes up in multiple sources is that these losses for Russia are essentially irreversible. Why is that?
That's absolutely key because, as the material points out, Russia simply cannot build new strategic bombers like the 295 Bear, the 222 M3 Backfire, or even the older variants of the 2160 Blackjack.
Production stopped.
Yeah, production lines for those models were shut down back in the mid-1990s after the Soviet collapse. The tooling, the expertise, much of it is gone.
But wait, aren't there reports about them building new 2160s, the 2160M?
Good point. Yeah. Yes, they are producing a very small number of new 2160Ms, but the analysis suggests these are largely assembled from old, leftover Soviet-era airframes and components. It's been called aviation cannibalism, using parts from retired or stored aircraft. It's not mass production from scratch.
So it's not like they can just ramp up production to replace these losses quickly.
Not at all. And their truly next-generation bomber project, the PAC-DA,
Right.
well, sources describe it as still being in the very early stages. A static prototype exists, maybe. Serial production, if it ever happens on a meaningful scale, is potentially a decade, maybe even 2 decades away.
And the operational fleet they had before this attack wasn't huge to begin with, right?
Now, not massive by superpower standards, estimates vary, but the number of actively flying strategic bombers capable of launching cruise missiles. The 2160s, 222 M3s, 295 MSs was already quite limited, maybe around 12 operational 2160s and roughly 40 or so of the others combined before this June 1st attack, give or take.
So hitting 11 confirmed destroyed, possibly more damaged. That's a serious chunk of their operational strategic air power.
A very significant portion. One estimate suggested this single operation took out roughly a third of Russia's strategic aviation component, capable of carrying long-range cruise missiles.
Wow, and that hits their nuclear triad too, doesn't it, the air-launched part?
Directly impacts the air leg, yes. And compounding the problem, even repairing damaged planes isn't easy or fast. Sources estimate it could take up to a year and cost maybe $100 million just to repair a damaged 295.
$100 million to repair?
Yeah, these are complex old machines. And it's made even harder because previous Ukrainian strikes have hit some of the key Russian aircraft repair facilities, like the one in Taganrog.
Right, I remember that. So the repair capacity itself is degraded.
Exactly. It all adds up to these losses being very difficult, if not impossible, to replace in the medium term.
I saw one expert used a really striking analogy to describe Russia's situation after this.
Yes, Anatoly Kripchinsky. He compared Russia after this attack to a chicken with his head cut off.
That's the one.
Still running around, perhaps, but fundamentally mortally wounded in its strategic deep rear. It's a powerful image to convey the perceived strategic impact.
Let's pivot then to the reactions. How did Russia itself and the rest of the world respond to this unprecedented operation?
Well, Russia's official reaction, at least initially from the Kremlin, was pretty muted. Standard procedure, almost. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said Putin was informed and investigation was underway.
The usual lines.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And directed further questions to the Ministry of Defense statement, which itself was quite minimal, just acknowledging attacks were repelled, which clearly wasn't the whole story.
But under the surface, among the pro-Kremlin commentators and military bloggers, it sounds like the reaction was quite different.
Oh, definitely. Much more vocal and frankly alarmed. Some prominent pro-Kremlin voices were openly calling it a Russian Pearl Harbor.
Strong words.
Very. Others, like the Rybar channel, which often reflects unofficial mock thinking, admitted it was a sensitive blow to Russia's nuclear potential and acknowledged that these losses, especially the bombers, were indeed irreplaceable, a rare admission of vulnerability.
Okay, so shifting outside Russia, what was the international reaction like in the media, among defense experts?
It was significant. Widespread coverage, lots of analysis focusing on really the sheer audacity, the uniqueness, and the technological sophistication involved.
We saw phrases like David versus Goliath popping up, right? CNN used that one, highlighting Ukraine striking deep into a much larger adversary.
Yes, that theme came up. The Economist went even further, stating flatly that it rewrites the rules of war.
That's a bold claim.
It is. Justin Bronk, a well-respected air power analyst, called it simply an astonishing success. And The Telegraph, picking up on the smuggling aspect, described the whole thing as worthy of a spy thriller.
Yeah, you can see why. The Washington Post seemed to focus on two key takeaways.
Right. They highlighted Ukraine's demonstrated ability to hit targets thousands of kilometers away, despite all the supposed limitations, and maybe more importantly, how it starkly exposed the vulnerability of Russia's key strategic airfields, places presumed safe.
And there was a sense that this sent a message beyond just Moscow, to Western allies, too.
Absolutely. That came through strongly in commentary from outlets like the BBC and even from unofficial but closely watched accounts like one linked to Mossad. The point being made was that this operation clearly demonstrates Ukraine still possesses significant capabilities, significant will, and isn't just, slowly losing ground.
It proves that Ukraine has cards to play, as one source put it.
Exactly. It counters narratives of stalemate or inevitable Russian victory. It shows ingenuity and impact.
And there was a political angle mentioned, too, wasn't there? Beyond the military implications.
Yes. One analysis framed it as a direct slap to the Russian security services, the FSB, the internal defenses who failed to prevent this, and also as a kind of political signal aimed particularly at the U.S. and maybe other partners.
A signal about what?
About Ukraine's own effectiveness and capability to achieve strategic effects, perhaps even beyond the debates about permissions for using Western-supplied weapons deep inside Russia, showing they have their own potent indigenous methods.
President Zelenskyy himself stated a goal for operations like this, didn't he? Something about forcing diplomacy.
Yes, his stated rationale, repeated after this, is that inflicting significant losses like these is the way to compel Russia to engage in true diplomacy, rather than just dictating terms, make the cost of continuing the war unbearable.
Though it's important to include the counter-argument that came up in some analysis.
Definitely. Analysts like Mick Ryan, for example, expressed skepticism. They argued that while tactically brilliant and damaging, a single attack like this, however successful, is unlikely to fundamentally change Putin's core strategic objectives for the war.
A dose of realism there.
That the strategic calculus in Moscow might be harder to shift.
So, looking ahead then, what are the broader implications? Where might things go from here, based on what the experts are suggesting?
Well, within the immediate conflict, one likely outcome is that Russia may feel pressured to compensate for this degradation of its strategic bomber force.
How?
By increasing attacks using other means. They still have in abundance more drone swarms of their own, more ballistic and cruise missiles launched from other platforms perhaps, trying to maintain the pressure.
And it undeniably lays bare that vulnerability deep inside Russia. That must have consequences.
Absolutely. The operation demonstrates, in very stark terms, that basically no location, no matter how far from the front lines, can be considered truly safe for Russia's high-value strategic assets anymore. That psychological impact and the need to potentially disperse assets or invest heavily in rear area defenses is significant.
What about Russian retaliation? Was there talk about how they might respond specifically to this attack?
Yes, some experts raise the possibility of a Russian response that might be more terroristic in nature, not necessarily targeting a high-value military asset in return, meaning a strike designed primarily for maximum informational and psychological effect. Something spectacular or causing civilian harm, perhaps, aimed at demonstrating strength and deterring future attacks, rather than achieving a specific military goal.
So a definite risk of escalation in the coming weeks or months.
Yes, several analysts seem to view further escalation as a very likely consequence following an operation of this magnitude and symbolic importance.
Stepping back, this whole operation feels like it just powerfully underlines the massive shift happening in warfare that we keep talking about.
It really does. It's maybe the single clearest example we've seen yet in this conflict of the new era of drone warfare, where relatively inexpensive, adaptable systems can effectively disable or destroy incredibly costly, complex, traditional military platforms.
Changing the entire cost-benefit analysis.
Completely, and challenging decades of military doctrine built around these big, expensive platforms.
So if you had to boil it down to one single strategic takeaway from Operation Web,
I'd say it shattered several core Russian narratives all at once.
Yeah.
The myth of their deep rear being invulnerable, the narrative of overwhelming technological superiority, It fundamentally challenged assumptions, both inside and outside Russia, about the nature of this conflict and potentially future ones.
So wrapping this up, you've had a chance now to sort of walk through the details from the material we looked at. Operation Web really does seem like this remarkable combination: technical ingenuity, strategic boldness, meticulous long-term planning.
It really does. And the outcome, based on the evidence, was a significant, likely irreversible blow to a key part of Russia's strategic air fleet, all achieved using surprisingly low-cost methods, relatively speaking.
And exposing those deep vulnerabilities in their defenses, things many probably didn't realize existed to this extent, and sending, as you said, very clear signals to Moscow, but also to the world about Ukraine's ongoing capabilities and resolve.
Undeniable signals, yeah.
It's just an event with so many layers, and maybe it leaves us, and you listening, with a final, pretty provocative thought to chew on as you process all this. If inexpensive, increasingly autonomous drones can penetrate thousands of kilometers into a major nuclear power's territory and successfully destroy multi-billion-dollar strategic assets, what does that fundamentally mean for the future of military power, for defense budgets, for the global security frameworks we've built around these big, expensive, traditional platforms like bombers and carriers?
Yeah, it forces a massive rethink, doesn't it? It challenges the very definition of what constitutes military strength and what constitutes vulnerability in the 21st century. A lot to consider.